All right, we're going to look at Harold Bloom's the Western Canon today, or that's our text. The topic is of canonicity and value, but the text is Harold Bloom's defense thereof in, I think it's 1995, called the Western Canon. And it doesn't come out of a vacuum. He's responding rather pugnaciously, probably angrily to some degree. Although, if you ever listen to Bloom, and I appended that interview from 60 Minutes and others, he's a humorous fellow. And so he's got sharp elbows, but at the same time, I think he's quite an entertaining, genial fellow. But the issue here is of canonicity and value. And in our day, so he writes this in 1995, and he writes it, and I'll start off by saying this, and I can't recall if I said it last class or not, but when he wrote this, and he was still at that point the foremost literary critic in the United States, and probably in the English-speaking world at the time, he regarded what he was now defending as under serious assault. In fact, to the degree that he thought that it was almost being his defense of the canon was too late. Basically, it was literary studies were being subsumed under cultural studies, and he lamented that, and he wanted to put out his view of what constituted the canon, the literary canon, and the value thereof, and so forth. And so then he wrote this, and I recall at the time, and I was in Durham at the time, and doing my PhD, I think so, 1995, yes. And I recall hearing, because at that point the internet, it existed, but it wasn't quite the thing it is now, that he was being at the MLA convention and so forth, the Modern Language Association, where he'd be a keynote speaker. He was being booed and heckled by other academics and so forth because of his stances, and he would be giving it back as well as he was receiving it, more or less. So that's the one thing. So he was speaking against in a rather hostile context. At this point, he was been a practitioner at Yale for 40 years, Sterling professor at Yale. But what I wanted to say is when he retired, and although he was at Yale for 40 years and a famous critic there, he had a huge library himself, a personal library, and he didn't leave it to Yale. He bequeathed it to a small Catholic liberal arts college. I think I said that. Did I say that? Yeah, I did. Okay. And the reason why he did is he said that these are the only places that still place any value on the text that I find valuable. And my sense, though, is that their value for it is not, and their defense of the canon doesn't have the same rationale that Bloom has. It's not simply art for art's sake. And I even wonder to some degree whether he's entirely serious when he says it, but I think he actually is. So as I said before we started recording, he's a very strange creature in that sense, and it could only exist in academia, where somebody was a total aesthete, like appreciated literary works, and he insists, and we'll come to his statement on this, that the literature has no relevance whatsoever. It's totally irrelevant, and it must be seen to be of no relevance whatsoever. In which case, to my mind, it begs the question: well, why would you bother reading it if its standard for canonicity is its total irrelevance? It must be relevant in some way. But I think he means by irrelevant to all political, social, moral, etc. considerations. Totally irrelevant. So it's a very strong position and a very strange position, and so defending the canon, and not a very traditional defense of the canon at that. Because others have defended the canon. There's a tradition, which we will see when we look at T.S. Eliot's Tradition and the Individual Talent, a traditional defense of the tradition, as it were, a canonical defense, and it's not on the basis of what Bloom says it is. So Bloom's defense of the canon is in some ways a repudiation of the canon, which is why I've always objected to it and thought it was a rather odd defense to make. It's idiosyncratic to Bloom, which is fine. Academia allows for odd birds to flourish within its confines, and I think that's actually a good thing. But it's not really a very robust defense there. But it comes in the context of what happens in the 1960s and in the 1970s when this thing called theory gets off the ground and starts becoming present in university English departments. And so it becomes a subject called literary theory. And theory is not the same thing as literary criticism. Now, we last semester we looked at a variety of authors, and they were usually poets themselves, although not always, but usually. And they would be talking about literary criticism and how we are to understand and critique, to discern what is literary. And they would be speaking of things like genres and meter and tropes and schemes and those sorts of things. That would be literary criticism. Literary theory is a sort of an extraneous, allegedly objective way of looking at literature without really looking at the literary nature of literature. And it, as I said, arises probably in 1968. I mean, it's there in the 60s as well, but in the general ferment of the 1960s. So it's a movement in the Western academic world and the social world, for that matter, when revolutionary politics are going on. So there's the Vietnam War, there are the protests against it, it's the context of the Cold War, and at the same time that there is actually a tangible military threat from the Soviet Union and its satellites around the world, from Cuba on through other allies in Latin America and in Africa and in communist China and so forth. So there's a military threat, the Eastern powers. In the Western world, there's also a ferment going on, and there's an anti-authoritarian and anti-traditional push within academia. And and within that, the idea of what literature was comes under serious scrutiny in a way that it had never been before. So last semester I finished with the Romantics' view of literature. And you've heard me say that I believe that the foundations of postmodernism are to some degree to be found in Romantic aesthetics. I don't know why that keeps happening in this class. I guess it's just first door you walk in, you turn right, you check the handle. I have no idea. Happens every class, right? But the Romantics, although they regard themselves as revolutionary, their context is the French Revolution, and they do genuinely question the view of what poetry is and what a poet is. And they disagree with the traditional subject matter of poetry. And they redefine heroism and they redefine literature. So we looked at Wordsworth and we looked at Coleridge, we looked at Keats. We didn't look at Shelley, and I regret that, but I already did 3 Romantics. And we could have looked at others in the period. There's something that's very different about it. And the view of poetry in the Romantics, it is something that is, originality is something that comes with it. So it's imaginative literature. And remember Eagleton last time presented it as the first possibility is that literature is imaginative writing. He gets that from the Romantics because they speak of poetry as the work of the imagination. They all refer to this faculty of the imagination. It's not a new faculty, but it has new significance in the Romantics. And it's connected with productions of originality. And so we have inherited their sensibilities. When I say we, the Western world in which most of us grew up and in which we still operated, I still think that holds. That when people think of creativity, they think of originality, total novelty, which is in itself a novelty. That view is a novelty. It doesn't exist before that. In fact, anyone who wrote before the Romantics would have regarded originality as absurd. If it's new, it must be wrong, they would have said. And the artist doesn't seek originality. The artist seeks excellence, not originality. Being original is in and of itself not something to be sought after. And so if you wanted to be a good writer, you would imitate those that had preceded you who were excellent. And you would have a wide canvas to draw upon of writers and critics and cultures, a wide palette of colors and different motifs and so forth and stories. And you would draw upon them. And they did. And so here at Tyndale, in intro, we largely use the epic, or at least I do in my intro, to give some sort of structure and arrangement to the works that follow. So we start with Homer's epic, and then we move through Virgil's epic, and we briefly allude to Ovid, but I don't spend too much time on that. Then we move forward to Dante and maybe to Beowulf. These are all epics, and they're all in conversation with the foregoing epics. It's explicit in the texts. And when they do this, not only are they demonstrating that they've read them, but that they want to be seen in the light of them, their own work, because they follow the same conventions. And they, to some degree, are also taking the big picture and talking about important things. They're talking about the underworld and the life after death. So whether it's Homer's underworld or Dante's hell, or on the other hand, the realm of the gods and the ultimate nature of goodness and beauty and truth and so forth. And so it's dealing with the most meaningful things. So that's what the epic would deal with. And a writer who wanted to be considered to be a good writer would engage with those same ideas and compare and contrast. Romantic originality still uses the epic, by the way. And so next year I'm going to teach a course in the Romantic epic. They're still writing them in the Romantic period. So there is a continuity there, and that's worth mentioning. For all of their originality, they don't mean it that seriously, because they're still using something of the old flagpole of genre and language that their predecessors had. But they are in some ways breaking from it in their claim. Again, the claim of originality is the best example of that. And Coleridge is the best critic of it. He thinks it's absurd. So he's really arguing against what his contemporaries are asserting in their theory about what they're doing. He thinks Wordsworth is a great poet. He just thinks his poetics is ridiculous, contradictory, and doesn't even hold true of his own writing. But that's where Bloom began, and he began with that. And from that, which we have inherited, that divide between fact and fiction arises as well. So fiction is imaginative writing. It never existed. It's wholly original. It comes from the artist's psyche, or his sense of what he or she wants to express. Whereas the realm of fact is dealing with historical, empirical evidence. It's recording things. And so there becomes the truthful, on the one hand, if it's factual reporting, and the imaginative and potentially fraudulent if it's dealing with fiction. So it becomes exactly what Plato accused the poets of in the ancient world, which is telling lies. And the Romantics, I guess, effectively embraced that. Of course we're telling lies. Or rather, we're not even claiming to tell the truth. But if you actually read the Romantics, that's not what they're saying. They do claim to be asserting truths, new truths about human nature. Right? They're not saying they're not Harold Bloom. Bloom, we'll come to Bloom in a minute. Bloom is saying that they're only talking about beauty and they're not talking about things that are true and good and so forth. They're making no such claims. Well, no writer has ever done that. And then Eagleton moves on then to other forms of that. But that's the context in which Bloom enters this debate about canonicity and so forth. Is that the backdrop of 1968 and the theory revolution? And up until that point, I think it is fair to say, though there are questions about what works will be in the canon, maybe, there is no dispute that there is such a thing and that it is a valuable thing and that it's central to the study of literature. So even back, last semester I looked at Horace and Ars Poetica, and he's talking about the categories of the Hellenistic critics and their genres and their schema and tropes and so forth, and all the things that are standards by which we are to judge and to become good poets ourselves. That tradition, which is the classical one, it holds more or less unbroken, even through the Romantic period. The Romantics are questioning it, and eventually they'll be the cause of the breakup. But even the Romantics haven't fully broken up with the old tradition. But in 1968 or thereabouts, it does happen. And at that point, the idea that there is a romantic / humanist rationale for reading literature goes away, or is no longer accepted as the consensus position. And for that reason, when theory was brought into university English departments in the 70s and 80s, the literature professors were implacably opposed to it. Some of them wanted it out. They didn't want it in at all. Why would we allow the fox into the hen house? Where do they belong? They don't belong in our department, but they were put in there all the same. But as I say, when I studied in the 80s and as an undergrad, I managed to evade it because I did a double major, so I managed to. Now for my sins, I had to come at it as a doctoral student, engage with it anyway. So anyway, but for a time, I was able to evade it. And nowadays, and that was a fourth year course like this one, nowadays I understand in most universities, it's right in first year English. They give you theory right at the front end, and you cannot even look at a literary text without looking at it through the lens of a literary theory. And the literary theories are many. So they're either feminist or Marxist or post-colonialist, or they're new historicist or postmodernist, or they're a cultural materialist, sort of cultural Marxist type approach. All of these approaches are thrown at you, or a queer theoretical approach. And though you get them depending on the instructor, you're going to get those as this is the way you are going to read this. And if you won't read it that way, then you're against the instructor, more or less, because there is a sort of an explicit agenda being presented as a way of writing. I'm not referring to the people there, although some people do take it personally when they're disagreed with. But that becomes more or less explicit now. Along with that, there's an erosion of what had existed up to this point, the difference between high culture and pop culture. For Horace, there's obviously high culture. To be cultured used to mean somebody who was highly educated and had developed discernment and taste, a critical awareness of what had happened before and a discrimination that came with it. Whereas popular culture, it's not that it was no culture, it's just that it didn't have the same standard and it didn't have the same meaning, culturally speaking. But come the 1960s and what follows, that distinction between high culture and pop culture goes. You will notice in Western society, along with the distinction there, pop culture is now high culture. And high culture is no culture, or it's rather oppressive. So there's an inversion. It's not just that the distinction is exploded, there's an inversion. So the Western culture, the canon that Bloom refers to, the tradition of English literature that goes back long before English was a language to the Greco-Roman world, the works of the Hebrew Bible and so forth, all of that will be dismissed as oppressive culture and to be denigrated as such. That becomes more and more common. And then there are various other accounts that arise in its place. But that change, and Bloom is writing his Western canon in the backdrop of what is coming and is now almost, well, where can you find a traditional defense of the canon? Anywhere. Now this is a really, so Bloom's defense is a very odd one, but up until that point, and I said to you last time, Bloom is a Romanticist, as in he is a Romantic scholar. That's where he cut his teeth. The Visionary Company, I believe, was his first book, which is about the Romantic authors. The 1960s, he's writing it. And eventually he becomes, and the Romantics, by the way, were regarded as a species of writers as opposed to the tradition, interestingly. So it's a weird thing for a Romanticist to become the arch defender of traditionalism, because the Romantics are themselves against the tradition, so to speak. They have a revolutionary politics and a revolutionary poetics. And as I say, it's really difficult for a Romantic scholar to end up being the defender of the tradition unless he has a very idiosyncratic notion of what that constitutes. And he does, in the end. But he evolves from that, and his own writing then establishes where he's going to stand on that front as a critic. And in the end, his last works are on Shakespeare. And he actually asserts it here in this work that Shakespeare is the canon, more or less. He is the measure. So the word canon means a ruler, a measure. It was first used in relation to the Bible. These are the works of the canon. They're the means by which we are going to measure what the Christian faith is. And there's debate between Protestants and Catholics, by the way, about what the canon is and who defines the canon. The Catholic position is that the Church determines the canon of Scripture. So it's the mark of authority that the Church has, because it's got the keys to the kingdom and so forth. I think the Protestant position is closer to you have no such authority. Nobody stands as a judge over Scripture as an authority. Rather, you recognize the authority inherent within these Scriptures. Right? You're acknowledging something that is authoritative. You are not pronouncing as the authority that these are the canon. Because otherwise, if that were the case, the Church, as in the Catholic Church, could then assert that actually there's a new canon. I'm not saying that this is a danger or anything like that, but that's not the standard of canonicity is the authority lodged already within the text, because these are the Word of God. And what's the test for that? Well, these works lead us to salvation in Jesus Christ. They point to Christ, who is the supreme authority, who's the head of the church and so forth, and of all creation. It's his authority that we find in the text. And that's what makes it canonical. He's the canon. So the Word within the Word. Anyway, that's a side note, although I think it's an important one, but that's the issue of canonicity. So it has an authority to it. And it's a measurement by which other works will be considered to be canonical or not. So I have my own take on this, obviously, and that's what you're going to get in this course anyway. I'm not just going to tell you what Bloom thinks and what Eagleton thinks. I'm going to tell you what I think. which is the only value I add here, is adding my input. Otherwise, you can just read the text yourself. And you can feel free to disagree with me, obviously. But that is what the canon would historically have meant if there was such a thing. But actually, I'm not sure that there is much discussion of a canon outside of the Bible up until relatively recently. So much so that I said to you that C.S. Lewis doesn't like the idea. Right, when he's writing in the 1930s and 40s, he's not very happy about the discussion. And the reason is probably slightly surprising. He doesn't like the idea of critics deciding what's going to be worth reading and what's not. He'll decide that for his own self. Thank you very much. And Bloom, to some degree, agrees with that. And Bloom's argument for establishing it is a pretty good one, and it's really just a pragmatic one. There are too many books that have been written now for any one person to read in his or her lifetime, even good ones. There are just too many. So we got to come up with something that we will consider someone who's read a lot, highly read, who has discernment, will be able to present to other people, here are the books you ought to read as well in your time. But of course, as soon as he does that, he's excluding some others. And so then he comes up with other measures and standards for why some people are in and some people are out. But relevance he dismisses. And I says, I think he does it somewhat tongue-in-cheek. He said it should have no relevance whatsoever. That is really speaking against his opponents, because that is their standard of canonicity, is its relevance to them and their interest group, their identity group, which they feel has been marginalized by this largely Western, white, male canon. So they feel excluded from that, and so it's not relevant to them as such. He doesn't say their authorship, their masculinity, their whatever are irrelevant. What's relevant is the truths contained therein. He says the whole issue of relevance is irrelevant, which an argument I would not make. I don't know how you can assert. He's arguing against the abolition of man from an extreme position on the opposite end. We defend beauty for beauty's sake. Whereas in the abolition of man, if you recall at the outset, they dismiss the very notion of beauty as a subjective thing and therefore irrelevant. And he says, yes, it is beautiful and it is irrelevant, and that's why we should do it. So it's a strange retort to the critique. But what he's trying to do is push it away from cultural studies. And so in a strange way, he is allied with Lewis, who's similarly concerned about the scientific way of understanding human nature and seeing everything as a cultural artifact. And so literary studies is just a species of archaeology, of the development of society. It's an expression of a writer, and the writer speaks on behalf of his or her age, of the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, puts it in form. His Geist, his spirit, her spirit, expresses the spirit of the age, and therefore that's the relevance of it. It's that it represents the age. So it's a social text. Bloom is saying it's not a social text. Its social relevance is not a consideration. Its sole concern is the individual. Bloom imagines readers being just like himself, sitting with his feet up in front of the fireplace with a book. And he's of no social significance. And he doesn't care to be. And that's what writers write for other writers. I find it an extraordinary thing to assert that if Shakespeare put his works on stage in a social context, in a social genre, in its drama, with Shakespeare, the way I read Shakespeare, as commenting on political issues and having a theological view of the universe in which there's meaning involved in every act, and particularly in the hierarchy of things. That's how I just taught my Shakespeare course. That's not Bloom's reading of Shakespeare. So Bloom, the archetypal defender of the canon, has a very odd and bizarre view of even his foremost man of letters, William Shakespeare. Shakespeare effectively wrote for Harold Bloom. This is absurd. Shakespeare would never have accepted this. It's not even remotely anything like a traditional defense of what he does. And if you further study Shakespeare, you see that Shakespeare is actually operating with a very medieval way of looking at the world. The genres that he uses, the conventions, the props, the so forth. He's speaking out of a tradition of plays that comes out of the medieval period, and so he's engaging with that furthermore. And his histories, well, he's plumbing history books from it, and he's obviously tweaking them and making them his own. But he nonetheless is making historical commentaries, and he's writing for kings and queens. They're in his audience along with the commoners. It's right. So Bloom is a very odd defender of the canon. But still, I put it on the course not because I support his view, but because he at least has that view and he pushes back on it, and it introduces the idea in the discussion. And it does highlight the fact that the idea of a literary canon is now indefensible in the academy, virtually. And what would it have been before this? Well, some thought that the canon of aesthetic values, even if you want to see it as aesthetic values, were inherent in the form. So in the genre, there's a certain type of aesthetic experience in the epic and in the tragedy and in the lyric poem and in various types of, in comedy and in those sorts of literary form. And those are there, and they are in the best works of literature, they are inextricably linked with the form. So some see that as the mark of literary greatness, and they then belong to the canon. For others, it's more of it's an inherent thing, or it's a subliminal thing, or it's a transcendent thing. You can't even point to the form. It's something else. It's the expression of the human spirit, a freedom. It's a resistance to categorization. So one says it's part of the categories, another it's resistant to those categories, and that's what makes it great. I don't think that's a great defense either myself. In either case, I don't think it's only about beauty, because I don't think literature only delights. I think it teaches. And it moves towards something. And that's not only the Bible. That's all literature. And again, those are words that movere et docere is right out of the classical tradition. But docere, to teach, it teaches something. There's a didactic function to literature, so it's not simply delighting. Music might fit more with the delighting, but even music, I think, in its delight, teaches something about beauty, namely that we believe it to be true. It's just not explicit in its teaching. It doesn't have the logos connected to it. It's more of a number. Numbers and mathematics go together. Whereas literature, to my mind, has a teaching element, and that's its real defense within the canon, in which case the canon, and here's the argument that I've presented throughout and the way this course is, or rather this degree has been taught, is the works of literature that go from Homer to Virgil and on down the tradition have adapted the form in conformity to Christian truth. And that changes what it regards as heroism. And it also, interestingly, changes what it understands as beauty. because Christ is the beautiful one, but he's also the one who was beaten to a bloody pulp. And there was nothing beautiful in him. There was no, we don't even know what Christ looked like, by the way. So you get paintings of Christ. There's no physical description of Christ in the Bible at all. And we get no comments from others about how attractive he was, how imposing, like he was tall, he was short. None of that even. We get it of David, right? So and physical descriptions of some of the prophets and kings and so forth, and Saul, a tall man. Jesus, you would have thought, no descriptive details whatsoever. His membership, he's part of Israel, of the house of David and so forth, that sort of thing. But nothing, his eye, nothing. And the things that we get from the prophets in the Old Testament, nothing in the New Testament. Really interesting. Other than his crucifixion, which in Roman view is the ugliest thing imaginable. It's unspeakably awful. And that's why they do it to their enemies, to humiliate them, to make it such an ugly thing that anyone would seek to avoid it. It's a deterrent, the ultimate deterrent. You're not only going to be killed, you're going to be crucified. Awful, ugly. And with their Jewish victims, they did it to them naked, because Jews don't, unlike the Romans and the Greeks, they don't take their clothes off in public, in the public baths and so forth. They cover themselves. There's modesty. There's the Mosaic laws on such matters. Right? So to do that to a Jewish victim is particularly humiliating and disgusting besides. They don't crucify their other victims, but the Jewish ones, they do. To add to the humiliation, so there's a great ugliness in the cross. And that is part of Christian beauty then, is something redemptive about even suffering. That becomes a part of the tradition. So the tragedy in Shakespeare, to use Bloom's author, there's something beautiful about these tragic events. And he changes the notion of what a tragedy is, right? Away from that of Oedipus, where the man walks out on a stick out of the city. He's an abomination. He has to leave the city. Shakespeare's tragedies do end with death. That's true. And yet something about God's providence is also asserted in that. There's a return of justice, a restoration of order in the death of a hero. So those things change in literature because of Christianity. And I think that later texts similarly show the mark of a renewed sense of what is truly meaningful and valuable. And that sense, how these categories and texts relate to one another and change over the course of time, that is its canonicity. But it's the comparative, it's the great tradition then. Authors speaking to other authors and all of them speaking to us. That's the best defense of it. And speaking to their culture furthermore, and transforming their culture, and the mores, and if you heard our speaker in chapel today, the Word of God being central there, transformatively and so forth. So the literary canon had been defended up until Bloom by Coleridge and by Matthew Arnold and F.R. Leavis. So Arnold in the late 19th century and F.R. Leavis in the 1930s. The canon was defended, but not for the reasons that Bloom defends it. So Arnold writes one on culture and anarchy. Arnold is not a Christian. He loves ancient Greece. He sees there's a culture and it's holding back the anarchy of the mass society in which he lives, in which there's a loss of appreciation for high culture, and he wants to hold it. And so I wanted to put Bloom in here, and obviously to discuss his take on it, and I'll get closer to it now in a sec. But I didn't want you to think that even in the 20th century, Bloom's view of the canon is hardly typical of the defenders of the canon. It's just simply not. And I don't think he defends it very well. He does it more tongue-in-cheek. And I'm still not sure whether he meant it seriously. But I think he actually did. I'm pretty sure. But it's a private event, and it's meaningful because it's irrelevant. It's only personally meaningful, but it's not socially relevant. And therefore it ought to continue. I don't even know where he gets the idea from. But I do think that the assertion of canonicity is important, if only for practical reasons, but it has more than practical reasons. If you are an educator and you're going to teach children books, you're going to give children books to read, which ones are you going to give them and why? Because again, in university, you only have so many texts you can deal with, even fewer you're going to have in a school, in a high school. Which books will you give them? And why would you give them those books? Knowing that there are all sorts of agendas, and everyone has an agenda, even if they're not aware of it. They usually are, but everyone has an agenda. Which would be the ones that we all ought to be able to agree on? That to me is, and then it's not going to be a matter of identity group, because everyone has an identity group. Some are less obvious than others. So I'm native, as you know, but I don't look like it. But I could claim that as an identity group, and it is, I guess, in a manner of speaking. But ought other people to read it because it's my identity group. Like, what's so important about my identity group? And if I do insist that it's mine, then it's not going to be yours. If you have a different identity group, why should I have such privilege? So for me, you want to go back to a humanistic defense of the canon. So it's something that ought to be true of all identity groups. There ought to be something that's common and true to all humanity. So the identity group politics, I am wholly on board with Mr. Bloom on this. And it's not even the particular one, it's any identity group politics. So I used to be on culture wars programs on the radio, and there was a atheist that I used to discuss things with, and he wanted me to join a men's rights types thing because he thought it was like a common ground. So that because he noted, and he noted rightly, that men are not even being allowed to speak on campuses. And so there ought to be these men's rights things, and he thought I would support that. And I thought, well, part of me does, but on the other hand, I'm not interested in any identity group being defended because it undermines my whole case, which I mean legitimately. I am for the human, not for any group. There's the great common ground, and if I can't uphold truth, beauty, goodness, and human nature in any way if I'm going to attenuate it, even if I think that there's a place for it, and I don't want to be associated with that, although I'm not opposed to it. I just don't, that's not where I want to go. But it preserves the culture, and it presents the culture, and the culture is an inheritance. And here's the problem that Bloom articulated, which is even more my problem, and it will be even more your problem. Culture is something that can be wiped out in one generation. So it's not like biology, where you preserve your appearance from your parents. There's a sort of a genetic inheritance and so forth with it. Culture is something that is passed down as something sacred from each generation to the next. And not just what the Bible says, although that's the most central thing, but also other things. Because there's an effect of biblical teaching on society. So our notions of what freedom is, the rule of law, the fact that we are all under the law, everyone without distinction, including the prime minister, including a president, including whatever. We're all equally under the law. Freedoms of speech and religion and conscience and so forth, they're not just Christian inheritances, they're Western inheritances. And they come out of a certain cultural context. That's, without the culture, you can't have the rights and the privileges. You're going to erode them, and I think that's what's happening right now. So that's my analysis of why culture is moving in a certain direction and freedoms are being eroded, and so are human rights. And by human rights, I'm now talking about the unborn and so forth. Because there's a common view of human nature which is no longer accepted commonly. So there's no common sense. So if there's no common sense, then there will be the sense that is put in its place by the rich and the powerful and the strident and the angry and the school of resentment, or ressentiment as Bloom calls it. They will speak. And ironically, they'll speak and claim legitimacy in speaking because they claim that they've been oppressed and excluded from the canon. And that's the politics of the left right now. I don't want to call it the liberal left because they're not liberal. And not even left for that matter, but I got some identity. Liberal means free. There's no freedom there. It's compulsion, coercion, stridency, and insistence, and very little in the sense of what I would regard as culture. So let's go to Bloom here, and what he says specifically. And I don't know if this is, I've got a different text than I think this. No, it's this. So originally, the canon meant the choice of books in our teaching institutions. So it wasn't the canon, it was just in our institution. Here it's Tyndale, but it could be anyone. Here's the canon, as in here are the pattern of we're going to do these books within the institution. And so at the end of the 4-year degree, we will assume that there's a basic core of text that everybody's read. So by the time you get to a 4th-year class like this, I refer to a text, I can assume that everybody in the room has read it and then can engage in a discussion about its merits. Right? So it just has a utility to that. And he says, despite the recent politics of multiculturalism, the canon's true question remains, what shall the individual who still desires to read attempt to read this late in history? Because the Bible's 70 years and 10 aren't enough to read all those texts. And an undergrad degree of 4 years is also nowhere near. So what ones are the most seminal? And so when I've had my syllabi question over the years, which isn't too often actually, I just say, okay, I can include that, and that's worthy of inclusion. But if I do that, I have to bump something. So, which one do you want me to bump then? Because that's what it comes down to. So, what am I going to drop off the syllabus if I do that? Because I can't just include, because then the reading list just keeps growing. It becomes unmanageable for the student. So something has to be bumped. What am I going to bump? And if I bump that, what are the implications of bumping that person off? Well, as I say, diverse writers and all that sort of stuff. That you're not making any argument for me. Diversity is no argument. I recognize what you're saying, but that's not what I don't even engage with that in teaching literature. Although if you want to make that argument, there's no greater diversity than in what Bloom will call the Western Canon. Because it's from multiple cultures, multiple ages, multiple languages, with huge diversity there. The classical age and the Christian are very different things. The Christian era is challenged by, so the expansion of Christianity to a worldwide phenomenon in the 18th century, these are now very different cultures. Sometimes texts, the writers are sympathetic to the cultures around them, sometimes they're critical of them. There's a lot of elements there that will express that conflict and contrast. What are the ones that we're going to read in a literature class? Not a history class. History will document them all, that's fine. But in a literature class, is it worth reading that text? If you're in cultural studies, the answer is yes. Is literature cultural studies? If it is cultural studies, which I always resist, it then fits into the school of the conditioners. which I argued against in Lewis. Or rather, use Lewis to argue his case against the conditioners. I just happen to agree with Lewis. In which case, they're trying to mold human nature, assuming that there is no nature to human nature. In which case, what are they making us into? And why should I trust them? So he's decrying the advent of cultural studies. And he asserts, reading the very best writers, let us say Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, oops, at this point, Tolstoy, is not going to make us better citizens. Art is perfectly useless, according to the sublime Oscar Wilde, who was right about everything. He also told us that all bad poetry is sincere, which is true. I like that myself. Had I the power to do so, I would command that these lines be engraved above every gate at every university so that each student might ponder the splendor of the insight. All bad poetry is sincere. Now, does that mean all good poetry is insincere? No, it does not. What it does is it questions that sincerity by the word sincere means sin means without, and the carry means wax. So it's without any, think of weights and measures in the ancient world. You'd stack things up on a balance, and you could add wax to them so it looked like they were bigger than they actually were, right? But to be sincere is to be truthful. People who are sincere are expressing their own feelings without any adornment, without any art. It's just pure emotional outpouring. He regards this as the recipe for terrible, unreadable writing, and he's right. So sincerity is not a form of art, or if it is, it's a form of bad art. So then he goes politically, so this is why he gets himself into serious trouble. President Clinton's inaugural poem by Maya Angelou was praised in a New York Times editorial as a work of Whitmanian magnitude, and its sincerity is indeed overwhelming. He says right after what he just said, right? Oh, gosh. You can see it, and it's just like, oh, ouch, that one. It joins all the other instantly canonical achievements that flood our academies. The unhappy truth is that we cannot help ourselves. We can resist up to a point, but past that point, even our own universities would feel compelled to indict us as racists and sexists. I recall one of us, doubtless with irony, telling a New York Times interviewer that, quote, we are all feminist critics. He could be quoting our prime minister, right? And then his comment, this is delicious, that is the rhetoric suitable for an occupied country. One that expects no liberation from liberation. That's a great line. Expects no liberation from liberation. We're all feminist critics. Well, of course we are. Who doesn't want to claim to be a feminist critic? Because otherwise you're an oppressor. And if you're an oppressor, obviously you're a criminal and you ought to be defenestrated, etc. Institutions may hope to follow the advice of the prince in Lampedusa's The Leopard, who counsels his peers, change everything just a little so as to keep everything exactly the same. So what's changed a little? So here's what's changed. Now the critics determine what you can read. And they determine what's good and what's true and what's beautiful, and you better not disagree with them because otherwise you're an oppressor. So is that education anymore? Is it outright, overt, in-your-face propaganda? I think it's obvious what my answer is. And then why would anyone do it? And so numbers in English departments have declined over the years. It used to be the case that English was one of the most popular degrees in every university because it was delightful and it did teach much and it was useful and you could apply it to other disciplines. It taught you to write and taught you to think. taught you to use your language in a way that was subtle and persuasive, when to be forceful and when to be, to touch your nose this way, or you can go around your head and touch it this way. There are two ways of touching your nose. You can go direct or you can go indirect. There are many forms of indirection, and they all have a rhetorical force. So reading literature makes you a good writer, and to some degree, insofar as it presents a view of human nature, it doesn't make you a better person, but it exposes you to better persons. Not that the writers had to be better persons, but to some degree, what they recommended was something that you ought to emulate and seek to live up to. And I think that's what drew me to English literature, even when it was dying on the vine. And I think that's why many people still do it. But nowadays, I don't think it even does that. So why would you go into that and pay the exorbitant sums if you knew what you were going to get is being sort of a quite overt indoctrination into the instructor's views, and if you don't, you will be suitably mocked and punished. I just don't know why anyone would inflict that upon themselves. So he says, cultural criticism is another dismal social science. But literary criticism as an art always was and always will be an elitist phenomenon. That's true. It was a mistake to believe that literary criticism could become a basis for democratic education or for societal improvement. When our English and other literature departments shrink to the dimensions of our current classics departments, which is that they basically disappear, ceding their grosser functions to the legions of cultural studies, we will perhaps be able to return to the study of the inescapable, to Shakespeare and his few peers, who after all invented all of us. Now this is rhetoric on his part, but it's one that he uses all the time. So his book is Shakespeare and the Invention of the Human. It's obviously rhetorically meant. Nonetheless, his defense against his opponents, I think, has a little bit of substance. Then he gives his view. Well, his view of literature, by the way, is very Freudian and psychoanalytic and so forth. He talks about it as a fight and a struggle and he's still using the terms of oppression and suppression and so forth. So if you want to get into Bloom's own criticism, you can do that. But so he writes his own literary theory is that of agon, a struggle, and a fight against oppression. So he reads the Romantics, by the way, as suffering what he calls the anxiety of influence. That's the title of the book. So basically, they all read in the wake of Milton and Shakespeare, and they were dominated by him, such that they were like Oedipus, who was afraid of fulfilling his destiny. So the great weight of their great parents weighed so heavily on them that it affected, that was his theory of art. It was a sort of a personal psychological outworking which is expressed in literature. I find it silly. But other people found it helpful. But I do take his point that seeing literary criticism as an outworking of ideology is to sell the past, and there's no more reason for literature at all if that's the case. And I don't know why anyone would do it, and increasingly people are voting with their feet by simply not taking literature in universities anymore, which is a very sad thing, but probably inevitable. I think there's a better rationale for it. This is one of the reasons I'm recording it. I want to put it out there. So that is more or less his take on it. And I think that, but his defense of it as purely aesthetic and that it has no relevance, I don't see how that is ever going to resuscitate literature departments or convince people to study or read great works of literature. And I don't think anyone does read it for that reason. although everyone experiences the delight that comes with it, but they know that there's more than that. And did Shakespeare really think, if he invented the human, that only aesthetics mattered? Beauty was the only thing that mattered to Shakespeare? Really? I don't see how that's even a remotely possible view. So if you take Bloom's thesis seriously that Shakespeare invents the human, then you would have to look at what Shakespeare says about that subject and his idea of aesthetics, and he would totally reject it and say this is the silliest, craziest. This is a crazy old man writing in the northeastern United States in one of the Ivy League institutions. Maybe he's gone senile. But at least he's pushing back against those that despise what they are teaching. And that's he loves what he does. That's apparent. If you read his works, there's a zest for it and a zeal and a delight which he transmits and is evident, and which has inspired other critics as well, and they take delight in his delight. But it's insufficient to support the endeavor that he is benefiting from. So that generation of critics, which is no longer with us, and amongst them I will include also Northrop Frye, who we will read later on this semester. Frye is a better critic to my mind. So we'll read some of his criticism, and he'll get into archetypal criticism. How do we understand literature? And now he's pushing in Jordan Peterson territory. There's something archetypally, fundamentally true about this, and it applies across the human condition, and it still speaks, however ancient, to our day. That's getting nearer. And he's asserting that there's truth in it, and not just beauty. And it has a moral element. There's a dramatic element to it. So that's a better defense. But I'm afraid that not long after I heard him, within a year, Northrop Frye is no longer with us. It was 1991 or 92 he died. He was just at U of T here for a few generations, even the principal there. Taught courses in the Bible as literature. So 3 books on it, in fact. But he was a good critic. And when he taught, when Bloom was taught, when both these men were taught, they were all taught this canon of works, and they all understood that the Bible was the great code of art. And so Frye writes his first book on the Bible as literature, and he calls it the Great Code, takes it directly from Blake. But that's just imaginative writing again. So is that sufficient? And to me, the answer is no, it's not. It's not just the Great Code. Because Blake's view of the imagination is a very odd one in the context of history, and even it's the product of the Enlightenment era. So there's reason and there's the imagination, and these two things are incommensurable. They don't fit together at all. Either you're rational or you're imaginative. Historically, I would say the two go together. The philosopher does talk about subject matter and deals with different subject matter than the poet. There's no doubt about that, but it's not as straightforward as separating reason from the imagination. That's a very odd view. It's a romantic view. It's an Enlightenment view. And we need to some degree to get rid of those categories to have a proper discussion, but that was the purpose of last semester's course, is to give a longer historical view. So it's a project on my part to some degree, I guess, to try and recover what was lost, or has not yet been lost, but has largely been lost, to preserve something that was good. Comments or questions about Eagleton and Bloom? So you heard Eagleton's take last time. Now you've got Bloom responding to Eagleton, quite frankly. And what do you think about this then? Because Eagleton effectively argues that there is no such thing as literature, that what we call literature is just a product of capitalist ideology. It's a commodity that's valuable to the community that creates it as such. And the importance of theory then is to expose this rhetoric of value as bankrupt. It's a subject, transitive assertion of value, which isn't there's no such thing as valuable. Because Shakespeare is valuable now, but one day he may not be. I think it's possible that people might think that Shakespeare is no longer valuable, but it won't be because they don't find him valuable, it'll be because they're told by their teachers that they can't like Shakespeare because he's an oppressor and a white, dead male. But I don't think it will work, because the truth is that he speaks to the truths about human nature, the nature of human nature. That's what, remember we looked at the great critic Samuel Johnson and his comment on Shakespeare, his notes on Shakespeare, and he talked about general human nature and how he portrayed that. He was capable of doing that. He didn't, he held the mirror up to nature, right? And he did it very well in a way that would mean that everyone read Shakespeare. Always. I'm with Johnson on this. I'm happy to have Bloom in the same boat, but I wouldn't want him as the spokesman for the tradition, because I just think he's almost indefensible. So for Eagleton, it is the mirror. It's the mirror of the liberal capital age, which he wishes were over. Competitive entrepreneurial business, so it's a commodity. It reflects that value, but that value is going to change because the coming communist era will put such things out to pasture forever. Yes?
I just think it's telling that Shakespeare's appeal is cross-cultural and also able to be modernly adapted, so the ideas have to be universal. If I guess you could someone could argue that we like it because it's old and a different thing, but if people do modern adaptations for it and sometimes keep the same ideas in it, so it has to have some sort of universal idea.
So what you just said about Shakespeare's adaptability, not only across ages, but across cultures, for me, this is one of the things that I would hold up against the idea that Shakespeare might prove not to be. I mean, theoretically, of course, I guess. But I think enough time has passed now, enough water's under the bridge, and the culture's sufficiently different that you would think if that were the case, we wouldn't be, that argument would have been made a long time ago. And the fact that he is well received in Japan and in Germany and every other country, and they find there's something of the human condition being expressed there that's so delightful and true that we want to hold on to it, I think that I agree.
I think it's also telling that his ideas are also medieval and or even older than him, so and still be fine.
And so they're not medieval. They are medieval in one sense, but they're generally true in transit, like across history. And he's speaking about the human condition, and he's talking about families. As the family change? Well, in our day, again, the conditioners want to change the definition of the family. So, and they want to say that, well, we don't live in a monarchy, so then what Shakespeare says about a monarchy is not going to appeal to us either. And that's true. Some of us wish that the monarchy didn't exist, but never mind. That's a bit too near and hurtful at this present time. But and yet it does. You can imagine under those conditions, with that worldview, this makes perfect sense, and it seems to fit furthermore. And that's even if you're not a Christian. If you're a Christian, it fits more because the idea that God is the king and rules and reigns through earthly leaders as well. He uses them. They're in positions of power and authority because he's put them there. So that, but even if you don't have that, as I say, in Japan, they still manage to love Shakespeare. And in Germany, where they have not had a monarchy in however many, again, they regard him as a great writer, and other countries likewise. So I think that there is something there. Yeah. And not just Shakespeare, but Shakespeare is perhaps the best defense of that. And the Bible, likewise, actually. Translation's a difficult thing into different languages, a very difficult thing. To capture the essence of the right, it does require great skill on the translator's part, but I understand from translators and people who've come to faith through this that the power of the scriptures has resonated in their language to them, which says something about the text and not just the language. It's not just the English language, it's the truth, and there's something in there that needs to be preserved. It's another case for the same thing, not to conflate the two there. But the idea that literature is a transitive category it's an empty set, there's nothing really within it, it's just a term that we use, I just think this is absurd. But having said that, and whether you and I agree with it, that is the dominant view of the cultural studies approaches, of which we will see a wide variety on this course. And we'll come across them and we'll look at the point that they have, but they're anti-humanist views. And I don't even object primarily as a Christian, I object as a human being. I mean, the two are connected, obviously, but I didn't like it before I was a Christian. I was with Bloom's, not one. He doesn't like it either. This sentiment is widespread and widely shared. There are a lot of people that like literature that hate what's taught in academic literature departments because they hate the very thing that they teach. Or maybe they don't teach it. Maybe they've substituted it with other texts that aren't actually worthy of study outside of a very small little group. In which case, whatever. Okay. That's suitable. Other comments or questions? I think next time, what do we move on to next time? I think we're looking at T.S. Eliot's Tradition and the Individual Talent. So that's a more traditional defense, although it's idiosyncratic, again, because it's Eliot, and Eliot is his own thing. And so he's on there because I thought I had to put him on there. On a 20th century, 21st century literary criticism thing, I had to bring Eliot into the consideration. But again, his view is a little bit strange, but we'll discuss that next time, and then we'll see how he engages with these other titles and other authors and other themes. Okay? So see you then.